The Hôtel de Ville, the Place Vendôme, the columns by Buren inside the Palais Royal, the old Orsay station, now the Orsay Museum by the River Seine, Saint-Eustache Church near Les Halles, the Bastille Column, the Louvre and its glass pyramid, Les Invalides and its golden dome, the majestic Notre Dame, Montmartre and Sacré-Cœur, and the easily recognizable Eiffel Tower. Paris as you've never seen it before. We'll come back here, but for now, let me take you on a long and wonderful flight to discover some of France's most beautiful places. We head west to Normandy and the Seine-Maritime. This series of cliffs, unbroken over 20 kilometers, a rugged coastline of vertical white chalk, is called the Côte d'Albâtre, the Alabaster Coast. As the sea mist dissipates and we gain in height, the whiteness of the cliffs and beaches suddenly appears, revealing what Victor Hugo called the biggest architectural monument in the world. Here's the famous gigantic 70-meter-high needle that rises from the sea. It was here that writer Maurice Leblanc set the best-known of his Arsène Lupin novels, The Hollow Needle. Étretat and its famous Pebble Beach. "25 kilometers south across the Seine estuary between Le Havre and Honfleur stands the Pont de Normandie, over 2 kilometers across. Completed in 1995, it's not a suspension bridge, but a cable-stayed bridge. It has 2 immense pillars from which 92 pairs of cables descend to support the steel roadbed. At this scale, people look like tiny insects on a huge spider's web. Honfleur, at the beginning of the Côte de Grâce, is a delightful town, full of history. Its charms were made popular by the 19th century Impressionist painters. Old, tall, corbelled houses stand around the port with its handsome yachts and large fishing boats. It was from here, in 1608, that Samuel de Champlain set sail to found the city of Quebec. 30 kilometers southeast, in the Eure, is Bec-Hellouin Abbey. All that remains of the former abbey is the tall Saint-Nicolas Tower, built in the 15th century. It was the belfry of the original church and stood imposing like a lighthouse. We return west to Lisieux in Calvados. Much of the town was destroyed by bombing and heavy shelling in June 1944, but the 12th century Saint-Pierre's Cathedral escaped damage, as did the Basilica of Sainte Thérèse, seen here, which had recently been built to honor the then newly canonized Thérèse of Lisieux. 25 kilometers to the north, up on the coast, is Deauville, the seaside resort made fashionable by the Duc de Morny, half-brother of the Emperor Napoleon III. It's famous for its racecourse, American-style cinema, luxury villas, and casino. And of course, its planche, or boardwalk, which in the 19th century spared those with decorum from getting sandy feet. The D-Day landings in June 1944 left painful and indelible scars on the Normandy landscape. Above Omaha Beach, the theater of the biggest amphibious operation in military history, is the huge American War Cemetery with the graves of almost 10,000 GIs. To the southwest, in the marsh, stretches out a sandy bay with such a feeble gradient that the incoming tide covers almost 30 kilometers before reaching the shore. In the middle of this tidal world, standing on a granite point some 80 meters high, is the 12th century abbey church of Mont Saint-Michel. The Archangel Michael, in brilliant golds, seems to soar above the terraced cloister decorated with Gothic filigree that still enhances the prodigious architecture of the ensemble once qualified as a medieval skyscraper. The architecture of the Mont Saint-Michel is extraordinary as its history. A first abbey church was built in 1017 on the remains of a 10th century double-naved pre-Romanesque church, the chapel of Notre-Dame-sous-Terre. Originally, this was a cavern dug out of the rock by Aubert, Bishop of Avranches. In the early 12th century, an imposing three-storied monastery, called La Merveille, the Wonder, was added to the north side of the church, flanking the rock. It was classified a historical monument by the French government in 1874, after which Mont Saint-Michel was restored. A religious community moved back into the monastic buildings in 1969. In 1877, a non-submersible causeway was built to definitively connect Mont Saint-Michel to the mainland. Further west, in the Ille-et-Vilaine, are the oyster beds that were much prized by the Romans. They lie just below the fishing port of Cancale, founded in 545. It's one of the jewels of the Côte d'Emeraude, the Emerald Coast. Saint-Malo, extraordinary star-shaped stone-walled city by the sea, home to the privateers Jacques Cartier, René Duguay-Trouin, and Robert Surcouf. From the sky, the ramparts built by the military architect Vauban and the granite houses form a citadel that has often been compared to a ship moored to dry land. During World War II, three-quarters of the old town was destroyed by bombing, but it was rebuilt and restored to its original 18th century condition. The town's motto is neither French nor Breton, but Malouin. few minutes away as the crow flies is Cap Fréhel, the high point of the coast, a heathland-covered mass of sandstone and porphyry which offers a fine view of the Channel Islands and which is now a nature reserve for seabirds. In the Baie de Saint-Brieuc, an islet, the Île Harbour, with its lighthouse set just off Saint-Quay-Portrieux. Bréa, an archipelago made up of two main islands known as the Flower Islands, surrounded by 86 islets and reefs. It's a spectacular sight, and the colors, from deep blue to bright pink, are simply stunning. At low tide, the coast breaks into a myriad of pink granite, providing a spectacle of astonishing shapes. Sunshine is omnipresent. It rains much less here than on the mainland. Bréa has a microclimate ideal for a quasi-Mediterranean vegetation: eucalyptus, palm trees, mimosas, fig trees, and giant hydrangeas. To the west of Bréa, the beginning of Le Trégor, one of 9 regions of Brittany with its famous pink granite coast. A mass of jagged, eroded, sculpted rock between which are ports and beaches. Formed over 200 million years ago by wind, rain, salt, and frost. Perros-Guirec, with its 2 wild and windswept beaches, Trestao and Trestrignel, is set in a protected natural site where earth and sea are scattered with pink granite rocks. Ploumanac provides an incredible view of the rocky outline of the pink coast. It's a paradise for walkers who can take advantage of numerous paths through this rock-strewn landscape. This fantasy castle on the Île de Costaires, surrounded by rock and vegetation, was built in the late 19th century by a Polish engineer. This rather eccentric residence has at one time been rented by celebrities such as Mike Brandt, Nicoletta, Yvonne Printemps, and Pierre Freinet. An unreal vision. Sand so fine and powdery you'd think you were in the Caribbean. But the seagulls, the chaos of rocks and the sea spray are there to remind you that you're still in the north of Brittany. 50 kilometers to the west, the Île de Batz, just off Roscoff. You can cross the bay in 20 minutes on one of the many shuttle boats, and you can tour the island by bicycle in an afternoon. The wild nature of this small, flat island has been perfectly preserved. It was off this coast in 1978, off Port Saul, that the Amoco Cadiz sank, spilling 232,000 metric tons of crude oil into the sea. This huge oil slick soiled the Brittany coastline for years, giving rise to ecological awareness for the first time in France. Ouessant, the island of lighthouses at the very edge of Europe, where the English Channel meets the Atlantic Ocean. Every year, 100,000 ships pass this point indicated by its lighthouses. For true enough, this jagged, filigreed coastline can be deadly. Le Cronan, a centre of Druidism, was built overlooking the bay of Douarnenez, which backs onto its sacred hill. It is so well conserved, it feels as if you've been transported back to the 16th century. Not an electricity cable or a TV antenna in sight, a splendidly authentic setting often used by filmmakers. Built in the 15th century, the Priory Church of Saint-Ronan is an architectural gem in granite. Every year in July, there is a religious procession to the top of the hill where the faithful walk around the monastery. This is called the Petite Troménie, from the Breton compound word trop-mini, meaning around, and monastery. Every 6 years is the Grande Troménie, which takes place on another site built in about 500 BC by the Celts. It is the most famous atonement pilgrimage in Brittany. Douarnenez was a major sardine fishing port in the early 20th century. It has a unique maritime heritage displayed in a port museum that contains superb old ships. We continue our flight west for about 20 kilometers to where the cliffs rise some 60 meters above the sea. Cap Sizun and its jagged granite rocks. As we pass at low altitude, they open the gate to the famous Baie des Trépassés. Look at the strength of the current. This massive, totally indestructible 26-meter high tower is sometimes completely engulfed by huge, crashing waves. La Pointe du Raz is a rocky headland classified as a French Natural Heritage Site. This spectacular bluff stands at one end of the Baie des Trépassés and at the other, the Pointe du Vent. When you're down there looking out to sea, the whole of continental Europe is behind you. This is Finistère, Finis, Terre, Land's End. A boat will take you further west to the first island 8 kilometers off the mainland, the Ile de Sein. It stands barely 150 centimeters above the sea. Several times in its past, the island and village have been entirely covered by the sea, forcing the 350 inhabitants to seek refuge in their attics. Here there are no roads, no cars. There is only nature, sea and wind on this unique strip of earth at the edge of Europe, to be discovered on foot, bicycle or horseback. The estuary of the Aude, this magnificent river that has its source only 56 kilometers away just beyond Quimper, in the heart of the Black Mountains, combines peaceful rural scenes with the violence of the Atlantic Ocean. Concarneau has an important place in the history of France, with its fortifications built in the 14th century. For a long time, Concarneau was a walled enclave only accessible through a drawbridge. The famous belfry above the watchtower is the symbol of the city that is the most visited historical monument in Brittany. This small, isolated island is the Ile de Groix, 8 kilometers long by 3 kilometers wide. But it has over 30 kilometers of coastal paths and 50 kilometers of inland paths. A major tuna fishing port in the early 20th century, work in the canneries and on farms was done by the women. La Trinité-sur-Mer, in the heart of the Baie de Quiberon, is a meeting place for some of the world's greatest sailors. 300 of them are members of the Société Nautique de la Trinité-sur-Mer, founded in 1897. It's the oldest sailing club in France. Over 1,500 yachts line up alongside a few simple fishing boats that bring in the day's catch, sold by auction on the marketplace. Not far away, close to the shore, one of the greatest mysteries. 2,935 megaliths lined up over 4 kilometers. The menhirs of Karnak, which date from 4,500 BC. It's one of the largest and most important prehistoric sites in the world. The most likely hypothesis is that it was the work of a tribe from Central Europe which thought this was the end of the Earth. The Gulf of Morbihan. In Breton, Morbihan means little sea. And it really is an inland sea, subjected to the tides of the Atlantic, to which it's linked by a narrow 1 kilometer long strait with violent currents. It's a swarm of 300 islets, only 30 of which are inhabited. The Gulf is calm. The varied landscapes have remained natural or even totally wild. At low tide, its often rocky coast gives way to vast mudflats enjoyed by keen walkers. "35 kilometers out at sea, Belle-Île-en-Mer is the biggest of the Breton Islands. It's 17 kilometers long. Le Palais is the main town built around a narrow gully that today harbors the marina. The port is overlooked by an imposing fortress, which was rebuilt by Vauban in the 17th century and is easily recognizable from the sky. This fort, for a long time used as a prison, is now the island's museum. The sun often shines brightly on these quaysides and brilliant white painted facades. Belle-Île is blessed with a microclimate. Here's one of Europe's biggest beaches, La Baule, a once deserted bay that customs officers called La Baule with an O, which meant floodable maritime prairie. Over the years, what was once merely a vast dune sheltered by an 800-hectare pine forest would become La Baule, the fashionable seaside resort for tourists drawn by its sun, casino and luxury spa hotels, and all in just over 100 years. At the mouth of the River Loire, we reach Nantes. Although capital of the Pays de Loire region, Nantes remains a Breton city. Here's the church of Saint-Nicolas, and the Saint-Pierre Cathedral contains the tomb of François II, last Duke of Brittany. 90 kilometers upstream is the Château d'Angers in the Maine-et-Loire. With its 17 towers, the medieval fortress built by Saint Louis, Louis IX of France, was the home of the Dukes of Anjou. A stone's throw from the chateau is the Cathedral of Saint-Maurice, with its stunning medieval stained glass windows. Angers is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We'll now follow the Loire upstream to see one wonder after another. "40 kilometers upstream is Saumur, famous for its equestrian shows and superb chateau that belonged to the Dukes of Anjou. Built in 1230 under Louis IX, its 4 octagonal towers were added in the 14th century by Louis I of Anjou. It's a veritable fortress that was used as a prison until 1815. Saumur has been an equestrian center since the 18th century. The École Nationale de Cavalerie was founded in 1814. The school was home to the elite cavalry regiment, Le Cadre Noir, which gave the town an international prestige. Look at the splendor of its immense stables. Fontevraud Abbey, founded in the 12th century, is the best preserved large medieval monastic complex in France. The Évreux Tower is an architectural gem. After the expulsion of the nuns in 1792, the abbey became a prison from 1804 until 1962. Chinon, sparkling white, standing out from its showcase of greenery above the river Vienne. There remain only ruins, but they give a good idea of the size of this ensemble built for the incessant wars between France and England. For centuries, control of the Loire was of great strategic importance. Chinon was also home to Rabelais, monk, writer, diplomat, doctor, and great humanist. We're flying over the forest of Chinon towards the gentle curves of the river Indre. From behind these trees suddenly appears Azay-le-Rideau. Built on pillars during the 16th century, this was one of Louis XIII's favorite pleasure chateaux, despite the dampness of the walls. Blending the charm of a French chateau with the majesty of an Italian palazzo, it's said to be the most beautiful masterpiece of the Renaissance in the region of Tours. Seven kilometers to the north, the Château de Langeais is the perfect example of a fortress built for war, transformed into a country residence during peacetime. Behind its severe-looking facade and turrets are refined gardens and grounds, but the drawbridge, ramparts and battlements testify to its bellicose past. Villandry, completed in 1536, was the last of the Renaissance chateaux to be built in the Loire Valley. As far as gardens can go, none can match Villandry. Seen from the sky, these geometric shapes and mosaics leap out at you. No theme is identical. An extraordinary 16th century maze. The three levels of the garden are irrigated by a canal punctuated by bridges and small waterfalls. A huge work of art pruned every day by an army of gardeners. The history of the chateau that overlooks the small town of Luynes, 7 kilometers from Villandry, goes back to the 12th century. On approach, we see again the austerity of the medieval ramparts and keep. But on the other side of the courtyard, the elegant lines of a pleasure chateau. We fly round Tours to the south and arrive at Montbazon, the 9-meter-high statue of the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus. This figure was placed in 1866 on a 20-meter-high ruined keep built by a Count of Anjou known as the Black Falcon. It overlooks Montbazon, a charming village of the Indre Valley. Just after Tours, Overlooking the Loire in the heart of the Vouvray vineyards, some of the oldest in the Loire Valley, is the small Château de Moncontour, built in the 15th century, revised in the 19th century, and restored after the fire of 1942. All his life, the author Balzac dreamt of buying it and living there. Sadly for him, his earnings were not enough. For nearly 2 centuries, it was here at Amboise and not in Paris that the kings of France ruled the land. From Louis XI to Francis I, it was their preferred residence. The chateau, revised as a luxury residence in 1492 by Charles VIII, overlooks the town from its rocky outcrop. It was built on the site of ancient Gallo-Roman fortifications. It was at Amboise that Leonardo da Vinci, a protégé of Francis I, ended his days. The tomb of the great Renaissance genius is in the Saint-Hubert Chapel inside the grounds of the chateau. Spanning the river Cher is the graceful Château de Chenonceau. What was once just a windmill was transformed over the centuries by a series of women. Diane de Poitiers designed the gardens and built the arches across the river. Look at the perfect puzzle of these gardens, where Catherine de' Medici gave masked balls and lavish parties. Catherine de' Medici also crowned the arches with an Italian-style gallery. Madame Dupin, friend of writer-philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, saved the chateau during the French Revolution. All this earned it the nickname Le Château des Dames, the ladies' chateau. The Château de Chaumont-sur-Loire stands on one of the highest hills along the banks of the Loire. It's a fine example of a blend of 2 distinct periods of construction. First, in the foreground, is the 15th century Gothic fortress. Then, added later, the turrets in the Renaissance style, which is much finer. The windows are wider, pinnacles were built on. The castle became a pleasure chateau. Finally, the superb grounds were laid out, planted with Lebanon cedars and sequoias. Built on the Loire, Blois was a royal estate until the 15th century. In the chateau courtyard, the famous Francis I staircase, one of the jewels of the Renaissance, was built between 1515 and 1524. The Cathedral of Saint Louis was destroyed by a tornado in 1678 and rebuilt less than 30 years later. We fly up the river Cosson to reach the edge of the Sologne region. And honor where honor is due, here is the grandest chateau of them all, Chambord. In 1519, Francis I decided to build a magnificent hunting residence in this region well stocked with game on a bend in the river Cosson, a tributary of the Loire. Chambord has all the hallmarks of a fairy tale castle. Its bluish domes and rounded minarets gave it a touch of the mysterious East, so prized at the time. 1,800 masons worked on sculpting the incredible roofs with their 800 capitals, 365 chimneys, and inside dozens of staircases, the most famous of which is the double spiral staircase designed by Leonardo da Vinci. An eccentric beauty described by Victor Hugo thus: "Every kind of magic, poetry, and folly is represented in the admirable bizarreness of this palace of fairies and knights." A flight over the Sologne, with its ponds, marshes and forests, brings us back to the Atlantic coast some 300 kilometers away. It only takes a glance to realize that Noirmoutier is no longer really an island. Firstly, the Passage du Gois, the causeway covered by 3 meters of seawater at high tide, which explains the refuge pylons for anyone caught unawares. Despite its connection to the mainland, the island remains wild. One surprising feature is that it actually lies below sea level, which explains the 18 kilometers of dikes. It's often compared to Holland with its polders, or to the Camargue due to its sultans. The port of L'Herbaudière, situated in the northwestern rocky part of the island, was joined to the mainland in 1971 by a bridge, to which the islanders, the Noirmoutrins, were opposed. 30 kilometers away is the Chien-Perrin lighthouse, built on a rock in the northwest of the Île-Dieu, the furthest island from the mainland of all the ocean islands. With only 5,000 inhabitants, it's practically deserted. From this rugged landscape rises up the Montgarny Castle. The 14th century ruins stand facing the sea. Worthy of an adventure movie setting, it inspired Hergé for his Tintin album, The Black Island. The wild coast to the west is made up of bare, almost red cliffs. Since 1988, the Ile de Ré has been linked to La Rochelle by a 3-kilometer-long bridge. The island is nicknamed Ré-la-Blanche, Ré the White, because of its chalk cliffs and fine, light-colored sand. The citadel, built by Vauban, is infamous for being the last stop for convicts being sent to Cayenne as late as the early 20th century. A stone's throw away, the island's capital, Saint-Martin-de-Ré, with its stores, port and yachts, and in the center, this islet inhabited by the privileged few. The whole town was fortified by Vauban in the late 17th century. The Phare des Baleines, whale lighthouse, took its name from the beaching of whales, a fairly common event up until the 16th century. These days, it's still common to see porpoises. The Salterns cover nearly 1,500 hectares. Salt is one of the island's main sources of income. Across the bridge, facing the sea, is the beautiful and rebellious 12th century city of La Rochelle. The entrance is guarded by two 14th century towers, La Tour de la Chaîne and the Tour Saint-Nicolas. They used to be linked by a heavy chain. The Port des Minimes, with its 3,300 boats, is the biggest marina in Europe. 12 kilometers to the south is the Ile d'Aix, 5 kilometers long by 1 kilometer wide. Here there are no cars, no roads, only footpaths, a place of calm and tranquility whose pebbled beach coasts are deserted. It was here that Napoleon Bonaparte stopped for a few hours before leaving for exile on St. Helena. Seen from the sky, the oyster beds make astonishing geometric shapes. Halfway between the Ile d'Aix and the Ile d'Oléron is Fort Boyard, but this stone shipwreck has never seen military action. Designed to strengthen the protection of the Rochefort arsenal, it was started in 1801 under Napoleon. It was finally completed 50 years later, by which time long-range artillery had rendered it obsolete. Ironically, it has been made famous by a TV game show. A little way along, back towards the coast, the Ile Madame, linked to the mainland by a natural causeway, La Passe aux Bœufs, which one discovers at low tide. A tiny island that harbours a handful of cows and some oyster basins. There are also some rather strange houses called carrelets, which are used for eel fishing. Five kilometers inland is Brouage, a bastion of the Catholic Church in this Protestant Huguenot land, of which Cardinal Richelieu was governor to maintain the grip of Louis XIII on Rochefort and La Rochelle. In the 16th century, it was a military port from which ships set sail to the Americas. When the army and navy left, the marshlands were invaded by mud. Today, Brouage is a port in the country, a ghost town. This river, the Seudre, is a mixture of salt water and soft water, ideal for the proliferation of what was a delicacy of the Romans, oysters. Today, it's before this row of delightful little white houses that at low tide the plates come to rest, the flat-bottomed boats without which oyster farmers wouldn't be able to exploit their saltwater beds. From the sky, this 3,000-hectare maze is a mosaic of varied colors and shapes. An immense field of oyster beds, mostly family-owned, stretching continuously down to the sea. These metal chassis hold the racks on which the oysters will grow for a year and a half. A few kilometers away, the mouth of the Seudre. This small 70-kilometer-long river flows into the oyster bed basin of Marennes. Standing out in the background is the Ile d'Oléron Bridge, and just in front, a fort built in the 17th century on a rocky horseshoe-shaped shelf, Fort du Chaput. It was built by Louis XIV's war minister Louvois, to the same principles as Vauban's military architecture. The last bastion built along the Charente coastline by Louis XIV, Fort du Chaput held a strategic position between the Ile d'Oléron and the mainland. The Ile d'Oléron is the biggest French island after Corsica. Every year it attracts hordes of tourists who enjoy its beautiful beaches, its forests, and its exceptionally mild climate. The Château d'Oléron quietly keeps watch over its island. The La Courbe lighthouse is just to the north of the Gironde estuary and dates from 1905. Saint-Georges de Didonne, just opposite the Médoc and the Pointe de Grave at the tip of the Gironde estuary. This natural border between the Poitou-Charentes region and Aquitaine is a veritable fjord filled with seawater until Bordeaux. The northern banks are lined with these fishing cabins, carrelets, mounted on stilts. They are privately owned by people who practice a certain type of fishing for eels, elvers, and notably sturgeon, the king of the estuary. Sturgeon fishing has been prohibited since 1982, as the species has all but disappeared. The principle is quite simple. Fishermen use a large square net operated by a pulley. The net is baited and lowered, then all you have to do is wait for low tide and the fish are trapped. Talmont Abbey clings to the cliff top some 25 meters up. This Romanesque gem of the Saintonge region is surrounded by a delightful seaman's cemetery. First built on in the 2nd century, this holy site, known best under its other name of the Church of Sainte-Radegonde, was an important stopping-off point for pilgrims going to Santiago de Compostela. Seven kilometers off the estuary, the Cordouan Lighthouse, classified a historical monument, is one of the oldest active lighthouses in France. Built on a rocky islet in the 17th century, the 68-meter-high White Tower is a veritable royal palace. This sumptuous building combined the functions of sea beacon, fortress, church, and royal residence. Protecting the building from the wrath of the ocean is a circular bastion, which houses the lighthouse keepers. We're now flying over the Médoc, near Pauillac, where over 100,000 hectares of vineyards surround some of the most prestigious chateaux in the world. Château Pichon-Longueville, a Grand Cru classé, was built in the 19th century in a neo-Renaissance style. The famous Château Lafite Rothschild, owned by the Baron de Rothschild since 1868. Only 100 hectares of vines that were already recorded in 325 BC. Look at the gently sloping vines on the right. That's the roof of the wine cellar that has also been planted. Here, there's not 1 square metre to waste. The Citadelle de Blaye was designed by Vauban on the orders of Louis XIV to protect Bordeaux. This perfectly conserved citadel is a veritable small town with a chapel, a cloister, and houses with gardens. Chateau Margaux, without doubt one of the most prestigious names in the world. With its 1802 facade, this chateau was also the residence of King Edward III of England. Its immense cellars, 100 meters long and 23 meters wide, and its 260 hectares of vines, which are still hand-picked, testify to its extraordinary opulence. The medieval village of Saint-Émilion evokes the most prestigious of Bordeaux appellations such as Château Figeac and Cheval Blanc. This walled city, founded by monks in the 12th century, was originally a simple hermit's cottage. From its long history remain some remarkable features, like this imposing square keep that rubs shoulders with the vines in the center of the village, or other magnificent ruins, like this monolithic church bell tower, isolated from the nave dug into the underground rock by the monks between the 9th and 12th centuries. In the center, the 12th century collegial church with its tall steeple and cloister rebuilt in the 14th century. In a divine light, we reach the edge of a forest overlooked by one of the most beautiful residences in the region, Château de la Brède. It was here that humanist philosopher Montesquieu was born, and where he would write the majority of his works. This feudal chateau, started in the 13th century, is surrounded by a moat and a real drawbridge. Montesquieu decided to create wide vistas around the chateau by imitating the vast lawns of English manor houses. Beautiful ornamental trees, some cedars of which still stand, made a transition between the forest and the surrounding vineyards. The chateau grounds have remained pretty much unaltered since the 18th century. Today, Château de la Brède is also a cru of the Grave appellation. "35 kilometers west, the Arcachon Basin has the peaceful charm and abeyance of the seaside resorts of old. It is in fact a triangular inland sea, bordered with pines and white sand, an immense green saltwater pond in the middle of which are oyster beds. It has a 120-hectare natural bird sanctuary at the southeastern tip of the basin to welcome wild migrating birds and keen ornithologists. The famous Île aux Oiseaux, Bird Island, is strictly protected and only dotted with a few houses on stilts, or cabane chanquée, which used to house the oysterbed keepers. The island is a half-land, half-water wilderness sprinkled sparsely with heather, pines, and salicornia. See how clear the water is. Nearby, a stunning and spectacular phenomenon, the Pilar Dune. It's the highest in Europe at 117 meters. This living, shifting mountain is as fascinating as it is disturbing. No vegetation can hold it down, and it just keeps on growing. It can be scaled by a wooden ladder, but this mass of sand grows 4 meters a year and has tripled in size in just 1 century. It's 3 kilometers long. As we head south, flying a few meters above the pines, we become aware of the immensity of this ocean of vegetation that is the Landes. Both wild and forested, it was entirely planted by man in 1857 on top of marshland. It's the biggest artificial forest in Europe, covering some 1,200,000 hectares. From the tip of the Gironde estuary to the beaches of Bayonne, the Côte d'Argent in Aquitaine provides 230 kilometers of white sand beaches almost in a single stretch. They're among the most beautiful in Europe. We reach Biarritz, the entrance to which is marked by the lighthouse on the Pointe de Saint-Martin. Originally a small whale fishing port, then a seaside resort, and now a surfer's paradise, Biarritz has undergone many changes over the course of its history. But it's first and foremost a love story. That of the Empress Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III, who fell in love with what was then a small seaside village. As a gift, her husband presented her with a summer residence, now the Hôtel du Palais. The Rocher de la Vierge, Rock of the Virgin, erected in 1865, protects fishermen like a reassuring patron saint. As we leave Biarritz, our adventure continues along the Basque coast, in the Gulf of Gascony, with the villages of Bidart and Guétari. Small resorts set on 4 kilometers of rocky cliffs. The Bay of Saint-Jean-de-Luz appears with its backdrop of Mount Rhône, and finally the ravishing facades of the Port de Saint-Jean. This peaceful fishing port was for a long time the haunt of privateers and buccaneers. In the 1950s, it was France's biggest tuna fishing port. Today, these beautiful Basque houses remind us of Venice's City of the Doge. Just behind, the town of Cibourg and Fort Sokoa, built in 1627 during the reign of Henry IV. This strategic military site was continuously transformed until the reign of Napoleon III, who built this immense 325-meter sea wall to protect French fishermen, for the Spanish were never far away. A few kilometers from the end of this curious cliff, sculpted into slabs and caves by erosion, is the border town of Hendaye, and just beyond, Spain. top of the hill is the stunning Château d'Abadia, built by the architect Viollet-le-Duc. Today it stands in the middle of the nature reserve under the aegis of the French Coastal Conservation Society. Hendaye, ocean-facing and surrounded by green hills, has a magnificent beach of fine sand. This river marks the border with Spain. Here we are facing the mythical mountain of the Basque, the last peak of the Pyrénées-Atlantiques department, Mount Rune. Its 900 meters overlooks both French and Spanish Basque country. On the summit, there used to be smugglers' inns. Nowadays, to reach the summit, you can take a small, unique cog railway, a collector's item unchanged since 1924, which climbs for 30 minutes at 8 kilometers per hour up slopes of 25 degrees. A historical monument which is a big hit with 250,000 visitors per year. Long before there was the train, the Empress Eugénie was one of the first to start the fashion for venturing to the summit. This is one of the renowned Potioc, the Basque horses, which were already here during prehistoric times and were painted on the walls of the Lascaux caves. They're so wild, they can only be caught with a lasso. Ten kilometers to the east, as the crow flies, is the charming Ainhoa, founded in the late 12th century. A classified bastide, or walled village, on the road to Santiago de Compostela. It's the most flowered village in France and is typical of the Basque country with its red roofs and white walls. Behind the church and cemetery is the second, if not the first, Basque religious site, the Pelota Court with its recognizable wall. Every match is subject to serious betting, a character trait of the excitable Basque. To the northeast and around a hill is Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. Nestling in a mountain-surrounded basin, this was another important stage on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, to which its opulent houses and square, fortified medieval church bear witness. As a sideshow to our flight, we're treated to an aerial ballet performed by these huge Pyrenean falcons. A 100 kilometers further east in the Hautes-Pyrénées department, Lourdes. A town apart since 1 p.m. on the 11th of February 1858, when the Virgin Mary appeared to Bernadette Soubirous. From the 11th to the 17th century, Lourdes was a major stronghold of the Comté de Bigorre and a strategic linchpin throughout the Pyrenean Wars. These days, along the river Gave de Pau, the basilica has 3 superposing shrines, the Church of the Rosary, the 13th century upper basilica, and between the two, the crypt. The Massabielle Grotto, with its altar, statue of the Virgin Mary, and cascade of candles, welcomes 6 million pilgrims a year, more than Rome, Mecca, or Jerusalem. We continue our flight and reach the Pic du Midi de Bigorre, which sits at the heart of the Hautes-Pyrénées. This peak, or needle, that rises above the clouds indicates south to the whole of the Adour Valley. The summit was flattened to build this observatory, the highest in Europe, which looks a bit like a ferry boat in the sky. At 2,877 meters, it's one of the highest inhabited places in France. Researchers and astronomers live there all year round. As we fly south, we come to the majestic Cirque de Gavarnie. It's an immense mountain chain with 20 kilometers of ridges. On the left is the Cascade du Cirque, the highest waterfall in Europe, which is fed by waters from the glaciers of the Pic du Marbore, some 3,250 meters high. The water cascades down the rock in several stages, one of which is over 400 meters long, in a frozen landscape of snow bridges, giving birth to the river Gave de Pau. High up in the Cirque, Roland's breach. Legend has it that Roland cleaved it with one blow of his sword to escape the pursuing Saracen army. It's a natural passage between France and Spain. As we fly along, we'll discover the Route des Cols, literally the road of mountain passes. This road is broken up into legendary stages of the Tour de France. Having gone past passes like the Col de Bisque, here's the Col du Tourmalet, probably the best known in the Pyrenees, since the Tour de France has passed through here every year since 1913. It reaches a height of 2,115 meters. In a helicopter, it only takes a few minutes to reach Le Plat d'Adé, above the little village of Saint-Lary. Its ski resort is one of the oldest in the Pyrenees. It was linked to the village by cable car, which in 1957 was the biggest in the world. Cyclists climb up 31 kilometers of winding roads to the 1,810-meter-high Col de Perresourde, the border between the Hautes-Pyrénées and the Haute-Garonne. Below the ski resort of Super-Bagnères is Luchon, the most elegant and most frequented spa resort in the Pyrenees. We're still in the Haute-Garonne at the foot of the Pyrenees. In this region, between mountain and plain, Le Comminges, suddenly rising up from an isolated hillock overlooking the Garonne Valley, is a historical site that some like to call the inland Mont Saint-Michel. The Cathedral of Sainte-Marie-de-Comminges is astounding, outlandishly huge compared to the small village of Saint-Bernard-de-Comminges. It took 500 years to build, from the 11th to the 16th century, which explains why this architectural wonder is both Romanesque and Gothic. It's crowned by a 12th century bell tower, a 33-meter-high square tower that looks like a fortress keep. The builders of the Middle Ages wanted a Gothic masterpiece with flying buttresses, pinnacles, and gargoyles. Some houses have been wonderfully restored, the most beautiful of which is now the local post office. We now head north into the Gers, land of D'Artagnan, Armagnac and Foie Gras. Here's the town of Auch. It is here that we discover an imposing architectural ensemble made up of a monumental staircase, the Sainte-Marie Cathedral, and the 14th century Tour d'Armagnac. Occupied by the Roman legions in 52 BC, capital of the Counts of Armagnac in the Middle Ages, transformed under Louis XV, Auch is what it always has been, the capital of Gascony. Let's fly off to discover what were Gascony's medieval new towns, built by the kings of France and England, the Bastide. About 350 of them remain in the region. They were built to encourage people to populate the countryside. They're all to the same geometric design, built around a square with arcades within a fortified wall. This is Mirande with its imposing 15th century Gothic cathedral, its pinnacles crowned with a cock, a cross, a moon, and a star. Engulfed in greenery, it deserves its nickname of Mirande la Jolie. Montesquieu, a fortified village of 300 inhabitants, is perched on a straight hill overlooking the small valley of the River Osse. Its Romanesque church was revised in the 15th century. Five kilometers away is Bassou. Built on the top of a small hill, for a long time it belonged to the archbishops of Auch, who fortified the village. The 43-meter-high keep still stands, its bulkiness accentuated by 4 thick corner buttresses crowned with graceful machicolations, a masterpiece of southwestern military architecture. Slightly lower down is the Sainte-Marie Church with its 16th century bell tower. Bassou is considered one of the most beautiful villages in France. Ten kilometers to the southwest is Marciac. This 13th century royal bastide still has its central square and beautiful arcade houses. Its church has the tallest steeple in the Gers, 87 meters. Its jazz festival grows in renown every year. A 10-kilometer jaunt along the famous hilltops of the Gers brings us to the royal bastide of Beaumarchais. Its founding was sealed on the 23rd of May 1288 with a shared ownership contract signed by King Philippe le Bel. Its 15th century church, Notre Dame, still takes pride of place in the village centre. We continue our flight over the Gers to Uzes, the official capital of Armagnac since 1862. Its history stretches back over 2,000 years. It was the last city to fall to the Roman legions of Julius Caesar. It was a favorite place of King Henry IV. The church dates from the 15th century, its stained glass windows from the 16th. L'Arcingle is a tiny fortified village in a marvelous state of preservation. It's known as the Carcassonne of the Gers. Surrounded by 13th century walls, L'Arcingle was a residence for the bishops of Condom. The ramparts, built on solid rock, have a circumference of 270 meters and have only one fortified point of access. A double-arched bridge passes between the two pillars which once supported the drawbridge. Close to the chateau is the Romanesque church Saint-Gismond, an architectural wonder. It's an exceptional site that attracts more and more visitors from all of Europe. Lectoure, capital of the Lomagne region, is one of the oldest towns in the Gers, founded in the 3rd century during the Gallo-Roman period. Saint-Gervais Cathedral was built in the 13th century, damaged in the 15th century during the Wars of Religion, and now shows the signs of the ensuing restoration work. Its 21-meter-high nave is separated from the choir and is surrounded by 7 chapels. We continue north into Lot-et-Garonne. Admire the tranquil majesty of the confluence of the rivers Garonne and the Tarn. This stunning aqueduct has taken the Canal du Midi across the Garonne for the past 150 years. An overall view of Agen, before flying east along the Garonne into Tarn-et-Garonne. This is Moissac on the River Tarn. It became wealthy in the 18th century as a center of transport of wheat from the hills of Quercy. The Garonne has another tributary, the famous Canal de Garonne, the extension to the Canal du Midi, which provides the link between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. "50 kilometers east, Puy-Celle-Ci, the invincible citadel, stands out from its hilltop. This superb fortified village was built in the 13th century to protect the inhabitants of the valley. Dominated by the steeple of its 14th century fortified church, the entire village still sits behind its fantastically preserved ramparts. It has survived the trials of time and the tribulations of history. "30 or so kilometers north, in the Lot, Caylus. Caylus became a royal village in 1270 and still bears the hallmarks of its good fortune. A 14th century covered market, opulent stone houses, and a fortified church. Cahors is a medieval town nestled between the steep slopes of the Cercle des Cévennes and a bend in the River Lot. The Pont Valentré, with its 3 fortified towers and 6 arches, is an exceptional example of medieval defensive architecture. Capital of the Lot, and also known for its vineyards, Cahors has managed to preserve its historical and architectural heritage. 12 kilometers upstream, perched on this huge rocky escarpment with a sheer drop below, the fabulous village of Saint-Cirq-la-Popie. Its church dates from the 15th century. Its rather squat bell tower and houses tightly packed around it are remarkably preserved. These old houses, with their brown-tiled roofs, interior courtyards, small ivy-clad gardens and corbelled facades, line the steep, narrow alleyways of the village. The location of the village enabled it to resist the English throughout the 100 Years' War, and it was never once captured. The river was a strategic axis long coveted by the enemy. Further north, via the Alzou Gorge, suddenly appears one of the most famous villages of Europe, Rocamadour. This vertiginous holy city is best summed up by an old saying: houses on the river, churches on the houses, rocks on the churches, castle on the rock. Clinging prodigiously to its 280-meter-high cliff face, Rocamadour seemingly defies the laws of gravity. This religious village, crowned by its castle ramparts, is the most visited tourist attraction in France after the Mont Saint-Michel. Before becoming a famous pilgrimage destination, Rocamadour was for a long time a hermit's refuge. In the 12th century, on Days of Atonement, 30,000 people thronged here and left with a feeling of awe that we still feel today. We head west into the Dordogne. Sarlat-la-Canéda, built in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, has an exceptional architectural heritage. Saint-Sacerdos Cathedral looks down on the pedestrian streets around the famous old marketplace, where still today buyers and sellers haggle over the price of poultry, seeds, nuts, and foie gras, and notably truffles. Nestled in a bend of the river Dordogne, the magnificent village of Bennac-et-Cazenach. Its tightly packed houses proudly display their medieval origin and climb like a vine up the cliff face. At the top of the cliff face, the chateau of the Baron of Bennac, an eagle's nest standing some 150 meters above the river Dordogne. Its appearance and position made it a coveted fortress during the 100 Years' War. Impregnable with its double walls and double ditches, it holds sway over the village built in steps between river and cliff top. Deep in the heart of the Périgord, a site inhabited since prehistoric times, the caves of the Brantôme Cliff. Surrounded by the river Dronne, this medieval town is nicknamed the Venice of the Périgord. Built entirely on an island, the town owes its fame to the imposing Benedictine Abbey, founded in 769 by Charlemagne. We now head towards Puy-de-Dôme in the Auvergne in the Massif Central. Deep in the valley of the river Siolet, in the Mont d'Or Massif, the village of Orcival, with its shale-tiled houses fanning out from its famous Romanesque basilica. Built in the 12th century, noted for its octagonal bell tower, the basilica is one of the series of major Romanesque churches in the Auvergne. These incredible cliffs were sculpted by nature. They're called prisms. These columns of rock were formed at the same time as the volcanoes. In fact, these strange shapes are slowly cooling lava split. In the Auvergne, they're known as organ pipes. We're in the heart of the regional natural park of the Volcan d'Auvergne, which contains no less than 100 volcanoes of varying shapes and sizes. Puy de Pariou, the park's biggest crater, 100 meters deep and 350 across. It's considered one of the most beautiful volcanoes of the range. Walking around it is an unforgettable experience. We're now approaching Puy-de-Dôme, a perfect cone crowned with a huge TV transmitter. Dormant for the past 12,000 years since the last ice age, it sits on a granite plateau. At 1,000 meters above the city of Clermont-Ferrand, it provides an extraordinary view of the whole of the Chaîne des Puys. The twin puits, Puy de la Vache and Puy de la Solace, owe their red color to the oxidization of iron in the stone. We're now flying towards the Mont d'Or Massif, ideal terrain for hiking, mountain biking, and hang gliding. The high point of this massif is here, the Puy de Sancy, one of the most frequented puits since there is a man-made path to the summit. A 20-minute climb up this log path brings you to the panoramic viewpoint some 1,885 meters up. It provides a view of the entire Auvergne, and sometimes even further, for on a clear day you can see the Northern Alps and Mont Blanc. This is the land of outward-bound vacations, a paradise for hikers with walks on the sides of volcanoes with zero risk, since they are, according to geologists, so young, only 100,000 years old. We arrive in southern Auvergne. In the heart of rich and sumptuous woodland, La Chaise-Dieu is overlooked by Casadei Abbey, the highest abbey in Europe in terms of altitude. Founded in the 11th century, the abbey's fate changed when in 1342 one of its former abbots, Pierre Roger, was elected pope and took the name Clement VI. On this rock was built the Château de Polignac, of which only the 11th century keep remains today. A few kilometers away, Le Puy-en-Velay, built on an old volcano. The volcanic origin Cornay Rock overlooks the town from a height of 130 meters and is crowned with the monumental statue of Notre-Dame de France. The Saint-Michel-d'Aiguille Chapel dates from the year 962 and testifies to the town's early religious history. A quick 50-kilometer detour west to the Cantal department. The capital of the Haute-Auvergne, Saint-Flour, at 900 meters altitude, dominated by the dark towers of its 15th century cathedral. This dark color, predominant in the buildings and the surrounding countryside, is the volcanic rock basalt, hardly surprising in the land of volcanoes. But watch how the sunlight turns these foreboding towers into pillars of gold. As we return to the waters of the river Truyère, we discover the famous Garabit Viaduct, the work of a certain Gustave Eiffel, who would later build the most famous tower in the world. We now head south towards the Cévennes. This national park was founded in 1970. It reaches into the Lozère and the Gard. Although the altitudes are not high, the terrain is nevertheless rugged, and the rivers, one flowing to the Mediterranean, the other to the Atlantic, have carved out impressive gorges. Nearby, on the highlands of the Languedoc, is Mende, at the gates of the Cévennes-en-Lozère, formerly Le Gévaudan. The old town is dwarfed by the vast towers of the 16th century cathedral. The great success of the cathedral is the marriage of neo-Gothic rebuilding work to the original Gothic architecture. This road is the famous stage of the Tour de France once won by French cyclist Laurent Jalabert. It's now known as La Montée Jalabert, Jalabert's Climb. Let's enjoy an aerial ballet from these vultures recently reintroduced into the Cévennes National Park. We arrive in the Aveyron. Imagine a small stream descending the slopes of Mount Lozère. A little further on, it forms a huge, winding, 83-kilometer-long deep corridor, varying in width from 30 to 500 meters. This corridor was dug into the limestone plateau over millions of years between the Causse de Sauveterre and the Causse de Méjean. It's called the Tarn Gorge. We're now above the Causse de Méjean, the highest of the plateaus. Its climate is extreme, freezing in winter and scorching in summer. The Causse is made up of vast, deserted plains. And there, just a little to the south, an astonishing sight, the latest great work of art, the Millau Viaduct, the tallest vehicular bridge in the world. Above Millau, between the Causse de Sauveterre and the Larzac, a roadbed of 2,460 meters. To keep the cables to a reasonable length, 7 concrete piers, the 2 tallest of which were built either side of the River Tarn. These are extended by 87-meter tall pylons. This elegant work, born of 21st century technology, completed and opened to the public in 2004. It reaches a height of 343 meters, a little taller than the Eiffel Tower.